Good evening. I'm Vicky Leung, President of the Harvard Club of the United Kingdom. Welcome to tonight's presentation on patient safety in the NHS. We welcome Professor Donald Berwick and Dr. Aidan Fowler. We're grateful that they found time to join us. And we welcome back Professor Jason Leach, who kindly agreed to speak to our club for a second time. I'll let my colleagues do the introduction of the speakers in greater detail. Just want to briefly tell you about the club. We are the umbrella organization for college graduates and alumni from all the Harvard graduate schools. And this event is a collaboration with the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Shared Interest Group in Healthcare. This is the latest of a series of collaborative events that we started during the pandemic. And thank you very much to David Rogers and Maria Boudreau from the School of Public Health. They've done much of the heavy lifting behind the scene and they're here with us tonight. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Stefan Serban, our Healthcare Shared Interest Group Chair.
Thank you very much, Vicky, and hello everyone. My name is Stefan Serban. I'm a consultant in dental public health at NHS England, and I'm serving as chair of the Shared Interest Group in Healthcare of Harvard Club UK. It is my great privilege to introduce to you today the first of our three distinguished speakers, Professor Don Berwick. Don is President Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Institute of Healthcare Improvement and former Administrator of the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. As a leading authority on healthcare quality and improvement, Don was asked by Prime Minister David Cameron in 2013 to carry out a review following the publication of the Francis Report into the breakdown of care at Mid Staffordshire hospitals. This year is the 10th anniversary of the publication of the Berwick Review on patient safety in the NHS in England. Our next speaker will be introduced by my co-host, Dr. Tassin Tayob, a medical doctor with a background in public health and innovation manager at Imperial College Health Partners.
Thank you, Stefan. I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Aidan Fowler. Dr. Fowler is the National Director of Patient Safety in England and the Deputy Chief Medical Officer at the Department of Health and Social Care. A surgeon by profession, he developed an interest in quality improvement while practicing as a consultant and has worked in safety improvement and harm reduction in the UK and internationally. In an interview for the NHS Leadership Academy late last year, Aidan described an approach to patient safety that seeks not to lay blame at the door of individuals, but to create a system and culture that prioritizes doing the right thing, learning from mistakes, and proactively and continuously reducing harm.
Thank you. And our third distinguished speaker this evening is Professor Jason Leach. Jason is the National Clinical Director of Healthcare Quality and Improvement and Senior Clinical Advisor to the Scottish Government. He provided key leadership throughout the response to the COVID pandemic and has been praised for his ability to translate complex scientific information to the public, providing calm and clear advice. Our panel this evening will begin the discussions on the main lessons and recommendations from the Berwick Review and what progress has been made in the last 10 years in terms of patient safety. Finally, the panel will discuss the current situation, especially in light of the recovery from the pandemic and future direction of travel in the NHS in delivering safe and high-quality healthcare services for patients. You can put any questions at any point in the Q&A function of the webinar, and my colleague Tassin and I will be reading out the questions to the speakers at the end of the webinar. Don, it has been 10 years since the report. Do you have any reflections on the last 10 years?
Well, first, thanks for having me, Stefan, Vicky, and my colleagues from the alumni group. And I want to just express my pleasure at joining Jason and Aidan here, two very good friends and very valued colleagues. It's a pleasure to be with them. I thought the use of my introductory remarks might be just to get everybody up to speed on what the report said. So I'm going to go back just a bit, and then I'll offer a couple quick comments on what I think has happened, but then look forward to Aidan and Jason's more informed review ideas. So just in case you missed the basic thread here, in the late, aughts and early 2010s, evidence developed that there was a trust, the Mid Staffordshire Foundation Trust, hospitals in Mid Staffordshire, that was having some very serious problems with mortality rates. The way we knew that was the NHS at the time was using the remarkably important work of Professor Sir Brian Jarman to index hospital standardized mortality rates, an epidemiologic tool for looking at mortality rates adjusted for important clinical variables that allowed us to compare, if you wanted hospitals A to B or sort of follow a hospital over time. Jarman's index showed an alarm signal that the death rates in Mid-Staffordshire had risen way above the alarm threshold, the 3 sigma alarm threshold, and were staying there over a period of several years. What happened was nothing. The mortality rates stayed high, and suspicion began to grow that something was seriously amiss. So serious was this that Robert Francis, a solicitor, was invited to conduct a massive study, which he did, interviewing hundreds and hundreds of people to try to understand what was going on that had made Mid-Staffordshire mortality rates rise without response. Robert Francis' report is itself an immense achievement, 1,700 pages long, with over 270 recommendations about what was going on there. As valuable as that proved, the government and the National Health Service felt that it was too much to take in, 270 recommendations. And therefore, Prime Minister David Cameron asked me to organize a smaller group. It ended up about 15 or 18 members to take the Francis report under advisement, to do some further inquiry about what had happened in mid-staffs, and then to produce a more focused report on particular activities that could be undertaken by government and by the NHS clinical and administrative leadership to prevent this from ever happening again. That led to the report, a promise to learn, a commitment to act. Now, I could go through each recommendation. I don't think I'll bother to recite them, but a couple of things I want to point out. One is that there was a universal finding in all of the investigation that the information that existed on Mid-Staffordshire's mortality rates was produced fear inside Mid-Staffordshire, hiding, and justification, in which actually the Mid-Staff's leadership engaged in activities to show that these deaths were inevitable or that they were insufficiently adjusted. And there was actually a remarkable report, which you could track down in the London Review of Books, of all places, showing how manipulation of data, not improvement, was the consequence of this. In addition, the public outrage had led to a call for the insertion through legislation of criminal penalties for non-disclosure or non-response to the kind of problems that had developed at Mid-Staffordshire. This was an idea endorsed by Robert Francis in his report, which further raised levels of fear. The committee that I had the privilege of leading was a remarkable group of people, executives, clinicians, most importantly, patients, 3 patients and family members who had been injured, not at Mid-Staffs, but elsewhere through errors or mistakes in care. The overall findings of this group, I would summarize as that the responses that you saw at Mid-Staffs, instead of improvement, hiding, were a consequence of a culture of fear, blame, finger pointing, and a misunderstanding of the mechanisms that actually produce safe cultures. Those mechanisms involved creating a different kind of atmosphere, open, exchanging ideas, disclosing readily for the purpose of learning, and most important, setting up learning cycles in which when something goes wrong, or more importantly, even when something almost goes wrong, it becomes well known, and the community of actors can take that under advisement and make sure that the problems are corrected or improvement occurs, and that the learning extends beyond the site of the problem, where it becomes a resource, a national resource for reducing risks to patients. The National Health Service had quite a distinguished record of that kind of investment in learning. The National Patient Safety Agency had been set up under Tony Blair to record what became hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of reports of things that went wrong, to use them for learning. Sir Liam Donaldson had become an international leader in the idea of prioritizing patient safety. You had world-class researchers in the safety field, inside and outside healthcare. The very dean of the studies of human error, Professor James Reason at Manchester, was among them. Mark de Laval at Great Ormond Street, Mike Durkin, and others became scholars in the safety field. But that was not put to use in the service of the Mid-Staffs problem. And instead, what we had was hiding, dissimulation, self-justification, and fear. We suggested in our report that that will never produce safety, that indeed the most important change that could be made in the National Health Service would be to take seriously the concept of a learning organization in which when things go wrong, blame is not the point, but learning is, harvesting knowledge, including setting up local supports for learning as well as at a national level. We called for a culture change, a learning organization, a promise to learn. Up until that time and since, there have been many individual examples in the NHS of places that I would say did have that cultural change. The East London Foundation Trust is one of my favorite, a mental health trust in London that became really world-class in its learning processes. David Dalton, now Sir David Dalton, who was on our commission, had led a remarkable work at Salford Royal Infirmary that had demonstrably improved safety. And not least, I'll mention that Jason Leach became, in my opinion, maybe the most capable international leader in the world of safety. And perhaps he'll talk a bit about the progress that was made in Scotland. Aidan Fowler himself became an absolute scholar and expert, helping out in Wales and since in the NHS. Since that report, I think progress has existed, but been mild. Partly because the NHS is a governmental system, but even without taking that into consideration, it's very hard to change from a culture of blame to a culture of learning. And I would say that's a journey only begun in the NHS right now. Investments need to be made in the infrastructural processes that support the exchange of information, and the temperature has to be reduced so that when things go wrong, of course, patients and families are made whole, but the workforce doesn't have to be scared about things going wrong because they now become assets, resources for helping others avoid the same kinds of problems. Aidan and Jason know much more about what's happened in the UK in the latter days since the report, but my sense is the journey is still needs to be underway. You did have a couple of cases in the UK that were setbacks. The Balgaba case, where a trainee who made a mistake, no question that she erred, was subjected to severe censure, even though it was a perfect example of systemic setup for failure. And it shows how slippery that slope is when you can go back into blame and head on a platter as if it would improve safety. It won't. So those are some general comments. Stefan, I'm happy to take more questions, but let me turn it over to Aidan and Jason so they can tell you what really happened.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Although healthcare is devolved between the four nations in the UK, what would be the commonalities that can be learned in terms of shared lessons between the four nations? And are there any mechanisms to share those learnings between the devolved administrations in terms of healthcare?
You could not have.
So let me. Sorry, Don.
There's a lot going on and very different in different countries. And if cross-national learning could occur, the whole UK as a whole would be better off. So Jason, I'm sorry for stepping on your line.
Not at all. Let me take that first, and then Aidan can debunk what I think is a smooth and easy communication process across the four versions of the National Health Service. No, we're not as good at it as we should be, Stefan. Let me take a step back though and say that the seminal work that Don led was, of course, for NHS England, but had massive implications for the other three national health services. So for those of you who haven't been paying attention to UK politics, we have four national health services. In fact, we have 7, but Jersey, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man will not be covered in the following webinar. But the 4 countries are England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, and we have a very devolved system of healthcare now. So NHS England is a different entity, a different structure to NHS Scotland. We can go into the details of how they vary at another time, perhaps, but even the terms and conditions of our doctors and nurses now are different. The fundamentals of free at the point of delivery, as Aneurin Bevan invented it in 1947, are still true. So that core is still true. So when I was asked to be on the Berwick Review by Don on behalf of the UK government in charge of NHS England, not NHS Scotland, there was a bit of a debate in Scotland about whether I should do that. Don was very gracious in suggesting that Scotland were ahead in some ways, behind in others. So we put a Scotsman on the English review, which was slightly controversial. And to tell you the truth, two things happened. So we were able to use some of our experience and what had happened in Scotland to inform. But more importantly, almost everything that the Berwick Review talks about in Mid Staffordshire, we also had in Scotland. So we have a lesser known version of Mid Staffordshire called the Vale of Leven. The Vale of Leven is a relatively small hospital north of Glasgow, mainly frail elderly and some unscheduled care. 37 elderly people died there of C. difficile that we gave them when they arrived to the hospital with another illness. And it was a massive scandal. There was a public inquiry, but it didn't reach the level, because of the size of the country, of the Mid Staffordshire inquiry, but it coincided almost exactly. So we had this burning platform of our mid-staffs. We called it the Vale of Leven, and you can look up the Vale of Leven inquiry. There's a similar inquiry as there was in mid-staffs. But we had done what became known as the Scottish Patient Safety Programme. And we can talk about the more recent versions of that, post-COVID, and now struggling to recoup some of those losses, let's call them. But at the time of this document, the Promise to Learn document, we had some success in safety improvements in the relatively low-hanging fruit. Infection rates, surgical deaths, pharmacy safety, leadership involvement. And that improvement is what we were able to bring Scotland, through the spokesperson of me, but the Scottish experience, into that environment where James Reason and others were able to bring other expertise. Before I answer your collaborative across the 4 UK questions, the other thing we were able to do is we were able, of course, to take the inside knowledge that we had from that review, because I was on it, and do it quickly in Scotland. So there were a few things that the review says you should do urgently. And I remember the day when Dawn split us into working groups. So there was a working group on legal, there was a working group on culture, there was a working group on patient involvement, etc. Exactly as you would expect, to divide up the work to get it done as quickly as we could. And we thought there wouldn't be much to do legally, but it turned out there were a couple of loopholes that required to be fixed at a legal level, but they were small, but very important. So there was no law in Scotland for negligence, true neglect inside hospitals. So we were able to fix that and introduce that relatively quickly. The other elements, person-centered, patient involvement, the culture change, we were able to then try and adapt what we already had to that environment. So we do collaborate across the 4 UK countries and across Europe. We have a number of IHI, where Dawn started and used to be the chief executive of, networks across Europe and across the world that bring countries together. Scandinavia, us, Belgium, Iceland, a number of other high performers, including some from the States and Canada. The Healthcare Alliance Europe is probably the most recent and best example of that. So if you're in a country that has none of that, then you're very welcome to come and join us and learn together. The 4 UK countries, because Aidan and I are kind of pals, but the English and the Scots don't really say that out loud, so don't tell anybody. But we collaborate, and there's a Welsh version of us and there's a Northern Irish version of us. So that's informal, but there are more formal connections between the governments, of course. The health ministers meet, the first ministers meet, etc., etc. So there are, and then there's a European and global version of that. In fact, we're about to meet in Switzerland at the 4th or 5th Healthcare Ministerial Summit on patient safety, started by the English minister when he was the health minister, Jeremy Hunt. He's now the Minister of Finance in England. But we're meeting again to bring ministers together to compare notes and share across multiple countries. Aidan, you might have something more controversial to say about those collaborations.
As if I would. So look, I think on the 4 nations thing, there is a reality here, which is that those of us kind of in charge and responsible for patient safety grew up together in this world, doing this work together. So we all know each other. We're very well networked. In fact, I did the job in Wales before I came to England, and I was responsible for the guy who's now there, and in part appointing him to his previous role. So I think we know each other very well. And I think the other thing, you know, there aren't a lot of positives that have come out of COVID, but we work together very closely on that across 4 nations. And Jason will remember being on a lot of calls with clinical leaders from across the 4 nations during that. So in times of extremis, we pulled together. And I think that strengthened the bonds. And I'm still on weekly CMO calls between all 4 nations, which are very collaborative. So I think those bonds are reasonably strong. And as Jason rightly points out, there are some European bonds. And I would also add in, and Jason, you mentioned the ministerial meeting, and we have meetings with WHO, which of course includes people from all around the world with experience in patient safety. And there's a lot of collaboration now, the likes of which I don't remember seeing previously. So I think there are a lot of ways in which we're able to collaborate on the work, despite the fact that I think sometimes our UK politics separates the countries more than is perhaps ideal. So that kind of answers that. I mean, lots of comments on what's been discussed so far. So very interesting to hear again Don's perspective on mid-staffs. We had a response to that, and I think there are some notable cultural things. So I remember talking to our previous, I don't know how many ago now, because we've had a few recently, Secretary of State for Health, Jeremy Hunt, who had a very strong interest in patient safety. And what people would say to him, also as he describes it, is, well, of course, Minister, people do get harmed in hospital, people do die, these are sick people. And that issue of explaining away what they were seeing meant that what he was hearing was people seemingly justifying what is described in the Francis report as unacceptable care. So I think that concerned him a great deal. Now, some of that resulted in activity that was potentially quite distracting. So there was a desire to find the other, if you like, bad guys in the pack by looking at the HSMR, which Don talked about, and Brian Jarman's work, and saying, well, who are the other people with problems around mortality? And we should be looking at those. And there was a thing called the Keir reviews, which were run by the then medical director of the English NHS, Sir Bruce Keir, a cardiac surgeon with a strong history in looking at data around cardiac surgery, going into those hospitals and doing an enormous piece of work to try and understand what was going on in those. And, you know, the reality is I don't think they were the 14 worst hospitals in the pack. They had some data issues, but I think there could have been another 14 in the 30 with the highest mortality rates that we could have looked at and found equal things. And of course, a lot of what we were seeing in those, and I was part of those reviews, was stuff that was pretty familiar and that we all needed to improve. So I think there is a debate about an ongoing debate, because we still do reviews where we see issues. We've had this in maternity recently, a couple of very high profile reviews of maternity systems, and we're doing similar things in mental health. And it's important that we hear from patients and that we go and explore where we see concerns. But I think we have to balance that against the fact that it can take up a huge amount of energy that could otherwise be invested in learning and improving for the whole system. So the assumption that then we're going into the only areas with problems, I think is potentially distracting from the fact that some of the stuff we recognize in these reviews is happening everywhere. So I think there's a little bit of me that worries we spend a lot of time looking backwards, and we clearly need to learn from that, and not enough time building forwards, if you like. And I think that culture shifted. So you've heard about the Scottish Patient Safety Programme. I was working in the Southwest. Again, Don will be familiar with that work because IHI were involved. And one of the cultural shifts that I found really interesting, and he talked about how that was a very positive, collaborative building environment, which I think is the kind of thing I'm talking about wanting to do more of, was a moment of shift where I remember an anaesthetist, an intensivist, describing where they've been working on CLABSI and saying, you know, we just accepted that line infections happened, and that you couldn't get too stressed about it. You needed to be able to move on and accept that happened. And then we realized when, for a period of about 3 months, there wasn't a single line infection across the intensive care units in the Southwest. And of course, we did have them after that. But that was the moment people went, this doesn't have to happen. Actually, there is stuff you can do about it. And I think that was a really important shift in that program, of a realization of things we've been accepting as normal and have become inured to didn't have to happen. And so I think those sorts of programs were a really good example of how we could get into positive areas, positive deviance, and work forwards and not spend quite so much time looking backwards, because, you know, rightly, as Don says about his report, the Francis report, and I think it's, I may be wrong and you may be right, but I think it's 290 plus recommendations, but whatever, it's a big number, asking busy people to read, absorb and understand a 1700 page report with all those recommendations. I remember looking at it at the time thinking, how on earth, whatever they are, however important, how on earth do we do this lot, and how do we actually spend our time doing the most important things and investing our time in that? So that was really difficult. And you mentioned also, I just wanted to respond on Baogaba, that had an enormous impact. I think most people didn't read the case and understand it fully, but the response to that and the impact it had and still has, and the fear it caused amongst clinicians, was hugely damaging. There's no doubt about that, and we still see the effects of that. And you know, at some point during this conversation, of course, we might want to get on to some of those recommendations, Don, that you made, and how we've progressed with them since.
Thank you. That's a very good point, actually. Perhaps we could look at some of those main recommendations, if the panel agrees, and how they were developed further. But also, as I was listening to you, it kind of got me thinking about how change management also seems to be playing a role between implementing these innovations or recommendations, also top to bottom, but potentially bottom to top as well, in terms of how they are being translated into practice.
Well, you know, the main core recommendation had to do with leadership, and that at both the National Health Service leadership level and the entity level, we need executive and board level championship of improvement of patient safety at the top of the strategic agenda. I would say that is a very difficult matter. When you have a leader like Jason Leach in Scotland, and for indeed the First Minister herself, always mindful of the safety issue, you get a lot more traction than when not. So I don't know, I'd have to ask Aidan and Jason for a read back on what's gone on in leadership in the NHS. I would say it's currently not a centralizing leadership issue, because they're so concerned about budget shortfalls, staffing shortfalls, and the terrible pressures for the pandemic and its sequelae. So it's awfully hard to keep safety on the front burner. We also believe there need to be national level mechanisms for exchange of knowledge, where moving information around is easy, not hard. Where if something happens in one person's patch, others will know it, and it's a way to learn. To do that, you need a safe environment. One of the other recommendations, we knew that the media atmosphere, the political atmosphere, contents of the Francis report were really emphasizing the need for criminal sanctions for non-disclosure, a duty of candor that would have literally criminal sanctions behind it. We were very nervous about that, as you heard from Aidan. When one person gets prosecuted for an error that many others could have happened to many others, it chills the whole atmosphere. That it kind of leads to a sense of inauthenticity about the commitment to actually learn, because if something goes wrong and you disclose it, you may be one of the heads on the platter. So we didn't totally dance away from it. We did say there are imaginable circumstances of such egregious nature where there should be sanctions at a high level. Unfortunately, when the report was released, I remember the morning, the national press picked up on that rather mild statement as their headline. And so 99 of our words were about learning, and one maybe about some sanctions, and it was the sanctions that hit the headline. So it's a very delicate matter. Ever since then, I don't really know what's happened in the UK in the wake of the Baogaba incident. It's not the only incident of its type, but it's an uphill battle. I think I'll pause on those right now and leave it to Jason and Aidan to comment further.
So I think I think you're right. I think you're right, Don. And we did it in Scotland. We did take the duty of candour recommendation and implement it. We tried to do it in a learning manner. So we now have compulsory duty of candour reporting from each of our delivery systems. So we have 13 health boards who provide population health to the population. We have no trusts in Scotland. So we have population health boards that have hospitals within them, and they have to publish duty of candour reports each year. And there is a legal requirement for duty of candour. The theory being that will feed its way through the system to the front line, and there will be a learning experience. Now, some of that is real. Some of that is, of course, smoke and mirrors. And when it's led well, that can be used as a tool to generate morbidity and mortality meetings. It can generate primary and secondary care discussing things more. And that's what we've seen across the system. But we've also seen newspapers that still concentrate on the high level harm and the high level cases. Your mention of the politics is crucial. Be careful what you wish for. We have a country's leader now. She was the health secretary. She's now the first minister, who unfortunately knows more about patient safety than me, and also asks her cabinet members for statistical process control charts. So I want you to imagine a world in which your leader of your country understands statistical process control. So during COVID, Nicola Sturgeon would say to her ministers, I don't want 2 data points, I want to see the data over time. So she learned inside the safety work how to be statistically literate and how to make changes in the right time and make those diagnoses appropriately. So we did see those outcomes done well. Whether we have seen true culture change, I think somebody else would have to judge. Some independent witness would have to judge. We have had a couple of independent witnesses come and see us, the Nuffield Trust, for example, and they gave us, I think, an overly generous report card, frankly. But they did say one of the things we had done was make patient safety a top priority, make it everybody's job, and we had some graphs that showed reduction in harm in some sectors. We then began to expand into more difficult areas following Dawn's report, and that was primary care, mental health, and maternity services. And that proved much more difficult than some of our acute care. We maybe don't have time to do all of that in detail, but we tried to use the same methods inside slightly more complex human systems, and we hit the buffers quicker. We made some changes, but as exposed across the whole of the UK in recent years, maternity services turn out to be one of the areas that worry all of us when we put our heads in the pillow.
So look, I think on duty of candour, I see it slightly differently in that I think sometimes what we've done is actually create permission around candour. So clinicians who were concerned that they shouldn't speak up, in the sort of sense that, told if you're involved in a car crash, don't admit fault for insurance purposes. People were thinking we mustn't admit fault, we mustn't admit liability, worrying about litigation and so on. And I think the duty of candour has said it's the right thing to do to speak up. And I think somehow that hasn't been seen as some legalistic requirement. It's been seen as a morally right thing to do. That may be a perspective on it, and you may have other people who disagree with me, but I think that's been a helpful thing overall. Of course, I'm always slightly worried when you come up with a very technical solution to what is an adaptive problem. There's a lot of complexity around who do you speak to about what and in what circumstances are advantageous. But put that aside, on the whole, I think that's been a really positive thing and has encouraged and required us to be open. And where individual clinicians were worried about their internal leadership and speaking out, I think that helps address some of that concern where that exists. I mean, to Jason's point about leadership, I think those of us who've spent a lot of time in this world are sort of gradually getting more influence for this. So, I think there are a number of people who, Don's mentioned certain organizations, East London, the previous chief executive of East London is now in charge of workforce for the NHS, and fully gets that work. So I think people are getting into positions of huge influence across the NHS in England who have grown up in the world of that quality improvement thinking. And are recognizing that if you look at by certain measures, so if you take CQC, the inspectorate's measures of who are outstanding organizations, universally they have a strong approach on patient safety. We now have organizations who are outstanding for patient safety, which we didn't have for some time. And they have a quality improvement approach. And whether that's IHI methodology or any other methodology, we know they're all broadly common STEM. They have taken an approach to quality improvement very deliberately from leadership down, and openness and leadership which goes out and embraces staff and walks the floor and so on. And it's not by accident that those are our outstanding organizations, and that is increasingly being recognized. Now, I personally have a frustration that it has taken us this long to embed quality improvement across our system. It is a big system. That makes it more difficult than my previous job in Wales, where we had 3.1 million population and we could get all the leadership of the NHS in Wales in one room. It was called Team Wales, they were all there. You can't do that in the same way in this country, so we have to break it down a bit. But it's taken a while, but there is now clearly a desire to embed some of that stuff, and we have been setting about transforming, where possible, the approach across the whole pathway of patient safety to make it more systemic and build some structure around it. And I could talk about that all night. I won't over dominate the conversation, but it's incredibly interesting when you look at the recommendations, Don, you put in your report and where we're at, and clearly there are some things we haven't cracked, and you talk about the prioritizing patient safety and prioritizing patients. And I remember before even I discovered IHI and had my IHI chip inserted, I had some training in change management from somebody who worked in a supermarket chain, I won't name it, doesn't matter, who said, we put our customers first, our staff clearly second, because without them we won't make the money, and the money comes third. And at the time I felt that the NHS was very much money first. We did things for the convenience of staff very often, and the patients were at bottom place. And mid-staff's changed that. Our whole thinking changed to prioritizing patients, and rightly so. But I think the risk was the staff slipped in the process, and we focused on money second, and the staff became third, and it felt a bit like that. And I think that was to our detriment. And we still struggle when the money becomes a problem, as it's always a problem to some extent. And we're going through issues at the moment where the system is under huge pressure, which anyone who, and to the issue of our news, that does have difficult issues. And when we published a whole patient safety strategy, the only thing they picked up on was the number of deaths that we were quite transparent about, that we thought were happening. So that's an issue. But with all the current pressures that you will see in the news, life is very difficult, and there is a risk that people go back to worrying about the money and what the press are saying, rather than focusing, as we should be, on this is all about patients, it's all about safety. Those things have to come first, and everything else must come after. Patients and the staff who care for them, and the money has to be visibly in third place in that hierarchy.
Thanks, Dr. Fowler. So we're going to move on to some of the great questions in the chat. And one of the first ones actually touches on what you were just speaking about. So how is it possible to make progress on patient safety when the whole system is currently under crisis? Would you be able to elaborate more on that, please?
Yeah, I'm using a really bad analogy on this, which I probably shouldn't, but I'll try it anyway. And I probably get all the names wrong, but I say it's like I was in a fight with Dr. David Bannerman, and suddenly he's turned into the Hulk. And just when I thought I was getting on top of things, he's sort of split the shirt and the big green man's come out, and things seem even more difficult than ever. It feels like there's this big issue, and the answer is that, look, you don't have to read many papers to see what's going on in our system, which is that, and flow is the issue. I mean, we have this issue that we can't get the system flowing well enough, and that means we've got backed up ambulances. And I read the incidents related to that, and they're very harrowing. And I see people who are waiting for category 2 ambulances, and the delay impacts on them. They've got chest pain and they can't get an ambulance to turn up within the specified time, and so on. And so I understand the impact of that, and the way we've responded that is to that is to say, well, we're shifting our thinking in safety. We haven't been visibly present in the world of flow and, ambulance handover and so on. Always, we've had a lot to do with, the usual BTE falls and pressure ulcers, all of which are still important, hospital-acquired infections and so on. But actually, we need to have a voice in talking about flow and the impact of it and learning from what's going on in that and advocating for change that will reduce the level of harm that undoubtedly is occurring as a result of those flow issues. We talk at the moment and we refresh our strategy periodically. We want it to be a live living document responding to the circumstances. And of course, we've had to respond to COVID and we're now having to respond to the current pressures. And so we talk about thinking in a more proactive way about our work and particularly real-time thinking. So not spending so much time looking backwards at what happened 5 years ago and understanding that, and not losing the focus on error, but also using a focus on what goes well in our system and trying to learn from where things are working, because at any one time there's always somewhere that's mastered some elements of this. So we're shifting our world to thinking more about operational issues, to trying to shift our culture to being much more proactive, which I think starts with doing more in real time. And actually COVID demonstrated that things that used to take months, so we'd see a particular error, and some of them are quite niche, I accept, of, the settings on a ventilator meant that people weren't setting the alarms to on and they were defaulted to off. And that would have had all sorts of processes around it that would have taken ages. And we realized we could get in touch with everyone with that machine on the same day, warn them of the concern and fix it with the manufacturers within days. And just small things like that, realizing that, an oxygen risk and things like that during COVID, which we could manage in virtually real time. So we're shifting to sensing in real time. Don't wait until however many people have been harmed by something. On the day I'm notified of things, I'm on to it and wanting to say, let's make sure this doesn't happen elsewhere and so on. But also we need to do more to see that stuff coming and prevent it. Difficult in the current situation. So three things: that the operational shift, the becoming proactive where possible, and certainly real-time thinking, but also then this kind of, we talk about safety 1 and safety 2, you can describe it in a variety of ways of, yes, of course, and I think it's Kathy Sutcliffe and Bob Wizz's book where they describe the fact that we've probably over-focused on error and not enough on actually where things work really well, which is a majority of the time, and how we can do more of that and learn from that and so on. And so we're trying to shift our thinking, and that's actually quite hard, as it turns out, because if you go to people and say, this is what went wrong in place A and we need to avoid it, they go, yes, we understand. If you go and say, this works really well just down the road from you and they're doing this and that, the first response is often, yeah, but that won't work here because we're different and we're this and we're that and the other. So actually trying to get people to collaborate in that way is quite hard, although we did it really well in COVID. So we're trying to do more of that and push that thinking. So I think to get back to your original question, yes, things are very difficult at the moment and we are having to change our thinking to match the circumstances in which we work and trying to get ourselves agency to influence some of those issues and where possible bring something new from, again, the reporting. You see them, this massive incident reporting saying, this is what we're seeing, this is where we think you could make change, this is what seems to be working in other places, and trying to get that information across to a system that of course is a bit blinkered by the fact that when things get tough, people find it more difficult to hear what's being presented to them.
Thank you. That's very good reflection. Different question, but kind of building on what you said also in terms of patients' interest, workforce and finances. In terms of the current strike actions that are taking place and the waiting times caused also by the delays. For Professor Berwick, a question here. How do you combine these conflicting interests sometimes between workforce rights who are struggling with the financial crisis themselves, but also patient safety? And what advice would you give to policymakers in this context? Thank you.
Well, I have a few comments. One is more mature view of safety in healthcare includes worker safety as at a very high level of importance. In fact, the ELF, the East London Foundation Trust, that we've been singing the praises of, began its work on quality. Its first projects were a safe environment for staff. And so in terms of well-being of staff, although that may not be what's generating their labor actions and strikes, it's an important part of the duty of the system to assure the safety of the workforce. And it can be done with the same improvement methods that we use to improve patient safety. Second, the pursuit of safety is very important. It's only one among the dimensions of quality, in which we talk about safety and effectiveness and patient-centeredness and timeliness and efficiency and equity. And I would say a general lesson is when you're working effectively on quality of care, you're decreasing waste for the workforce. They have less junk to do. They can more focus on need. So there's actually a benefit to the workforce in terms of work conditions when effective attention is being given to the continual improvement of processes. Immense amount of waste exists in the system, and the workforce will tell you that. They'll say, I'm wasting my time filling out forms or doing tasks that have no meaning, or just responding to demands that have nothing to do with the needs of patients. So, my rose-colored glasses say if we work on quality in all its dimensions, including safety, we can make a better work environment and less interest in the workforce in having to go into forms of protest. That said, I'm not naive. Quality improvement, including safety, is not a panacea. There are many other circumstances that affect the workforce. I don't know if this has directly to do with job actions. Again, Jason dealt with this at a high level of leadership in Scotland, and you may want to talk, Jason, about when this sense of stress and overwhelming demand and maybe anger in the workforce accumulates. Where does safety fit in at that point?
So I've never met a clinician that didn't want to do safety first, for safety to be the most important thing. Of course they care about wages, and they care about paying the energy bills, and they care about their terms and conditions. Of course they do. So do I. But when you sit them down in a room and you ask a room of nurses, what do you want to do today? They all talk about the quality of the care they're able to deliver. Now, it so happens that across Western Europe and across much of the world just now, coming out of COVID and coming out of an economic crisis or into an economic crisis, then we have a considerable challenge around industrial relations. And all four countries in the UK are dealing with that in different ways. Some of that is above Aidan and I's pay grade and is being discussed with elected officials, and we're giving advice to try and solve it. So I, like Don, I'm not naive enough to think that can be resolved by the model for improvement or drawing a driver diagram. At some level, the politicians have to decide how much we're going to pay our health and social care workers, how many we're going to have, how many we're going to put through social care school, medical school and dental school, etc. So all of that has to happen. Now, we can have a webinar on how we try and solve those industrial relations and workforce things if you'd like. That's a very worthy subject. That world is not mutually exclusive of improving and optimizing the system within which you're working. So there are leadership gurus who talk about your circle of influence and your circle of concern. So my circle of concern, of course, includes the nursing strike, of course, includes the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis. But there's only so much I can do in that space. I can advise the First Minister, I can try and help in the negotiations. My principal area of influence is inside the quality improvement elements of what we can do around patient safety. And that's about helping with flow, it's about helping with infections, it's about helping with the primary, secondary care liaison. It's in that optimizing the system. So just because it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't try and optimize the piece of the system we're in charge of. So if you're in charge of a care home, then you should be trying to optimize the piece of the system you're in. If you're in intensive care or in an emergency department with trolleys lining up, your role is to try and optimize the system. At the same time, of course, your nursing reps and your union are trying to negotiate better salaries, better terms and conditions, and that will go on. The layering of industrial relations and strikes on top of patient safety, of course, aren't easy bedfellows. And we will do all the mitigation things we need. We will try and do emergency staffing. We will try and do all of the things we need to do in the moments of crisis when we have nursing strikes or ambulance services strikes, but they are in the round. The more important thing for all of the clinicians and the managers is to drive and optimize the piece of the puzzle they're in. I was reminded by Aidan's remarks when Dawn first took me to Cincinnati Children's Hospital, one of the safest and highest quality hospitals in the world. And it was the first time I'd ever seen on a safety chart on the wall, they had infections, falls, and flow. So they actually called out people who waited too long as a safety issue, not as a financial or a flow issue. They put it on the same level as those who were harmed by surgical mortality, those who were harmed by catching C. difficile. And the same people, the doctors, nurses, and managers in charge of patient safety, were therefore trying to optimize the flow problem. It became their challenge to fix as a triad of manager, nurse, and doctor usually. And it changed the conversation, changed the dialogue. Now that sounds like, I mean, it's a little bit nirvana, like that suddenly because you put patient safety above it, we'll be able to fix it. Of course not. It's hard to fix, particularly in the UK just now, when all roads lead to social care. And actually the block and the challenge is in social care, and that stops the flow through the building. But the alternative, of course, in the questionnaire is to be crippled by the complexity and put our head under the duvet and not get up. That's the alternative. And I don't like that alternative. This is hard, but the alternative is worse.
Well, don't start me on complexity theorists, but let's go back to Don, your comments on the work of quality improvement in work, improving the work environment and improving work and reducing the amount of work. And I think that's right. I think the caveat I would say is that there is some discretionary effort required, probably long term, but there is effort required to achieve that in the first place, which is additional to the standard work. And I guess the place I think of with this was having to work really hard with a team when we did some work in Portugal on infection reduction. It was an orthopedic team with very high rates, you know, that worried them. Undoubtedly, their lives were made miserable by the fact they had these infection rates, and they were saying it was because of, you know, the hospital they were in and whether it was coming through the teeth and local dentistry, all sorts of things. And we really had to struggle with them, and they had to make a big effort and trying to get them to do that, to reduce this harm and get them to believe in the work we were doing was really hard. But the belief afterwards and the gratitude and how it had transformed their lives was just so revealing, which is if you just make that effort and get beyond that hump of work, it really, really does pay back. And I think, you know, with reference to industrial relations, which is a really important and difficult topic, our staff are not venal. They're not, you know, they're not after money for the sake of it. They are struggling, as people are, with the cost of living and so on, but they're also very worried about conditions and how they've deteriorated. And, you know, we come out of COVID and you know, very interesting hearing a talk from an expert on disaster recovery. He said, be in no doubt that this is a disaster and the biggest, and that, you know, you would predict after any of these things certain elements during the very difficult recovery period from big incidents like this, including an exodus of staff who found it really traumatic and so on. And this was predictable, not easy to fix. And so that's put pressure on the remaining staff, who now find their conditions worse and so on. And you reach this tipping point where, and you know, it behoves the government to run the health system as lean as possible, because any money you spend on health is not spent on education, which impacts on health, and all the other things. And Don, I remember you showing us the budget of Massachusetts, I think, at one point, and how health had gone up to the expense of everything else. And that's a really difficult balance. And we have, as never before, a chancellor who is undoubtedly interested. I'm looking at his book. It's on my boss's desk just over the way, that he's written on patient safety. He's interested in patient safety genuinely more than any chancellor we've had before, and is now having to juggle with the problem of balancing inflation against wage and so on. And it's a really, really difficult thing to do, but I don't think it's that people don't understand the challenges for our staff, but I think it's just really problematic. But I mean, it's this risk if you run a system relatively lean and then you take a hit like COVID, unmasks your underlying, we had too few staff and we hadn't spent enough on capital, and that's become manifest by a challenge, and that's going to be really tough to sort out, but sort it out we must.
Thank you. Taksin, would you like to ask probably the final question? We've got 5 minutes.
Thanks. So considering our last few minutes, there was a question about training and how patient safety will be included into professional training in the UK. And we'd be interested to hear from Jason and Aidan about that in the last few minutes.
Yeah, it's a good question, Tassin, and I think there's two levels. Aidan might have a more formal answer. He might know the trainee answer a bit better than me. So there's safety included now in most undergraduate curricula for the main professions. Remember, there are 57 different professions in the National Health Service. This is not just doctors and nurses. There's all kinds of people. There are play therapists and people who do x-rays and people who do plumbing. We have the most electricians of any profession in the country. So you got to think about the health service as a very broad group of individuals. The two principal clinical and the most common people are nurses and doctors, but we have masses of physios, occupational therapists, even dentists like me, and others throughout the process. So safety, stroke quality, stroke person-centered care is now included in almost every curricula of the student curricula working into there. We then, particularly in medical training, it varies a little by specialty. The anaesthetists were right in the forefront, and some are a little bit slower. My own specialty in oral surgery is a little bit slower. They now have some elements of safety included in all of those curricula. So in Scotland, you can't qualify as a surgeon without knowing about the checklist, without having done the checklist, without the practical elements of the checklist. They don't even know it was the safety programme, of course. They just know the checklist is an important thing to do. And even in COVID, the checklist has still remained a very important thing to do. It's not got the Scottish Patient Safety Programme logo in it anymore. It's just done. People get cannulas only when they need them. That's a very radical idea. When I trained, everybody got a cannula, whether you needed it or not. So some of those embedded changes haven't been adjusted by COVID. So that's the formal bit. The more informal bit is in Scotland, you can learn this stuff in a deep way by coming on one of our courses. We have a number of fellowships where you can learn to be a quality improvement expert with a project, with a team of people, with a peer group. You do 9 months, 4 residential weeks. We call it the Scottish Quality and Safety Fellowship, of course. And we also have, and the thing that I get quite excited about, we're just restarting it again, is the Scottish Improvement Leaders Programme. The Scottish Improvement Leaders Programme is the same curricula, 9 months, 4 residential weeks, but it's not just health and social care. It is teachers and criminal justice experts and politicians, would you believe, and civil servants and all kinds of other public servants and third sector people who come and learn the method and then apply it to social work, to education, to water supply, to whatever it happens to be. And we sell that to the world a little bit in order to give it to the Scots for free. So we sell it to the English, so the English will give it to the Scots for nothing, which is, I think, quite a neat business model. So the formal piece exists and is a bit variable for doctors, and that more informal piece where you choose to be a quality improver, we now have that pretty well established in Scotland. Now we've got about 2,000 people who've been through that process in Scotland in the last decade.
Thank you very much.
So I'll just bring you quickly back to patient safety training in a way a little bit from quality improvement training, slightly different. We have developed a syllabus for patient safety training and curricula coming from that, and levels of training. We've done the first 2, we're going to do 5. We have a series of patient safety specialists now across the system who will all be trained at a higher level in patient safety because they're going to run a patient safety system for their organization. We are going to expect everyone working in the health service to do basic level patient safety training. And I have got very good at answering the question, but why should our electricians do it? Why should our finance people do it? Why is it relevant to them? And the answer is, the more you look at it, the more you realize why. So electricians work in electrical systems in amongst oxygen, and finance people choose what to prioritize when they buy. And our porters manage oxygen systems and need to understand infection control and so on. So whoever you look at, they can influence safety. So we will be aiming to train all of them, but we've got to get that training as good as possible before we even consider mandating it for everyone. But it is an offer to everyone and has been taken up by tens of thousands of people already. So we're kind of formalizing, if you like, that approach.
Thank you very much. I'm mindful of time as well, and we are extremely grateful for all our distinguished speakers for generously offering us your time. Thank you very much, Don, Jason, and Aidan, for being with us this evening. It was a great privilege to listen to your reflections on patient safety in the NHS, especially in the current climate of winter pressures and the recovery from the pandemic. Harvard Club UK and the Shared Interest Group in Healthcare always welcomes collaborative events between alumni groups from different Harvard schools. Many thanks to my co-host, Dr. Tassin Tayob, and to our president, Dr. Vicky Leong. We are most grateful for the continued support of Dr. David Rogers and Marielle Baudreau from the Office of Alumni Affairs of Harvard THN School of Public Health. And to you all, our members and our guests, thank you for coming, and we look forward to welcoming you all the next time. Thank you.
I hope so, Stefan. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.